I'm David Gushee, and I am thrilled to be in conversation today with my dear friend of longstanding, Robbie Jones. And it's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Robbie.
Well, thanks, David. Yeah, no, I'm very happy to be chatting with you today.
So today we're talking about both of our books, which are about to be released. Robbie's extraordinary new book is called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, and mine is called Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. And we're just talking briefly today about these books, where they intersect, what they're trying to do, how they build on what we've done before, what's different about them. So I thought I would start, Robbie, by asking you, where does this new book, Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, fit in your trajectory? How did you get to this topic in this way?
Yeah, well, first, I want to say that you and I have both been working on these books and not been in communication about it, even though you and I are friends and have been kind of fellow travelers, both personally and academically for some time. So I think it's notable that we both have landed on writing books that address the contemporary threat of white Christian nationalism. And in some ways, what I'm doing is taking it back as far as I can trace it historically, and you're taking it across the world, right? And looking at how it's showing up in contemporary places. So I think it's actually a great juxtaposition here. So on my end, that is basically how I see this book. It's the third book I've written on this problem of kind of the entanglement of white supremacy and Christianity in the U.S. Context. So my first book in 2016 was called The End of White Christian America. It was really about tracing the demographic changes in the country that we were facing and how that was really, I think, tipping many white Christians off balance as they saw the country changing around them and saw themselves no longer at the center and no longer the demographic majority in the country. Just one quick number there, recently in 2008, the election of our first African-American president, the country was still majority white and Christian. It's 54% white and Christian. By the end of his tenure as president, the country had dropped to be 47% white and Christian, and it's 42% white and Christian today, right? So that's a big shift and a major sea change in the kind of ethno-religious identity of the country. And that's part of what set up the kind of visceral, divisive, violent, even politics that we have today. The last book, White Too Long, was really about my own family story. And it was kind of really part memoir of tracing how this shows up in my own life as someone who grew up Southern Baptist in Mississippi with roots that go back into Middle Georgia 6 generations, including people who were both Baptists and enslavers. And how do I reckon with that legacy? And so that book spent most of its time really in the 19th century, and this book goes back to the 15th century, trying to figure out, well, if we trace this thread back, where is the most immediate departure point for white Christians that gets us into this place where we treat indigenous people with genocide, displacement, and then we enslave other people. Where do we get that justification, and where does it come from? So that's kind of what I'm up to.
I can't help but marvel and celebrate. I mean, when I first knew you, you were mainly working on data collection related to kind of all things religious and so on in the U.S. Your work is evolving to be public intellectual history and memoir and diagnostics about kind of some of the deepest toxicity in our culture. Did you imagine that you would go there, or how you feel like you've been led on this journey?
Well, I wish I could say, well, 10 years ago, I had this master plan of writing these 3 books, but it really wasn't that at all. I think it has been a slow and some like kind of embarrassingly slow when I look back on it, path of really just reckoning with this problem of how even in my own, the culture that I inherited, the religion that I inherited, how much it was entangled with white supremacist assumptions, ideas, history, that was unacknowledged, and really wasn't dealt with in a way that was still present with us, and that we see more and more today. So, I think it has been been very personal journey, and I think we're all kind of called to kind of use the tools that we have, and some PhD in religion, trained in sociology, and so part of it, yes, is the demographics and measuring current public opinion, but I think part of it was also taking the historical perspective that the educational opportunities I had gave me, and really digging further into it, and frankly filling holes that was in my own education with regard to the interaction of white Christians, not only with African Americans, but I think more in this book, what preceded that, which is the white Christianity's interactions with the original inhabitants of these lands and indigenous peoples. So, what about you? I want to turn it to you though,
Okay.
because I was, as I said, you and I hadn't talked before I saw your new book, and I know previously you've written, about kind of white Christians in Germany, right, in the Nazi era, and stuff. But I hadn't seen you quite do the international comparative work that you have done in this book, which is also a departure from for you. And I had said, as scholars, I think we all tend to get in our little silos. For me, it was expanding into the history of indigenous people that I knew very little about. And for you, though, you've got 6 countries in this
7
book?
yeah
Seven countries in this book that
yeah
you've had to kind of wrap your head around enough to kind of see these patterns that exist. So, I mean, how did you get there?
I think that one of the things we very much have in common is that we are white Christian men from the South, or whose careers or lives spent a lot of time in the South, who have lived through the trajectory of American history, with the shocks of everything that has happened, I would say, since Barack Obama became president, and the way that white Christians, white evangelicals especially, responded to him, all the way through everything that has happened in the Trump era. I think we're still in the Trump era in terms of him dominating our politics. And it has been an unveiling, an apocalypse. That's, I mean, that, the Greek there means basically an unveiling of deep, deep moral wrong, and a deep moral wrong that is embedded in what I think we would both strongly agree as a deep distortion of the Christian religion, deeply damaged by white supremacism and racism. And so we're both digging at the roots of that. There's no way to not do that if we're going to take seriously what has been revealed before our eyes. And so you decided to dig, you might say, subterraneanly into the very foundational strata of the American story. I decided to do, well, first, I wanted to see if I could name and understand what kind of Christianity gives us people waving American, Confederate, and Trump flags on January 6th at the Capitol. And Christian flags too. American, Confederate, Trump, and Christian flags at the Capitol, right? And what kind of Christianity gives us strong support for Donald Trump, despite everything, even to this day. And I was also wanting to interrogate whether the language that has come to dominate the conversation in the last 4 years, the language of Christian nationalism, fully captured how to describe this phenomenon. And so I dug around in some of the literature, not just kind of sermons or rabble-rousers, but also what some of the kind of conservative scholars are saying, people who are sympathetic to the, you might say, the right-wing project. And I concluded that it's a certain kind of politics that can best be described as authoritarian and reactionary. it's reactionary in the sense that it's reacting negatively to pretty much every cultural change since the 1960s. And it's authoritarian in that partly it thinks the answer to the ills of American society is a return to an authoritarian Christian vision, quite possibly one that is enforced by a Christian head of state or written into the Constitution, including an overriding of our heritage of separation of church and state. And that this authoritarianism, for the first time in my lifetime, doesn't seem especially concerned to protect democracy and its processes itself. Mm. The idea is, and all you have to do is read just a little bit in this literature, is we are in a culture war. The liberals are demonic and they're trying to destroy our children and take their souls and so on. We need to take our country back, make America great again. Apparently, regular political strategies are not quite working. We may not be able to confine our actions to regular politics. We might need to do things like coups and manipulating democratic processes so that it's no longer a democracy. So I started off saying, you know, this is what I think we have in the US right now in the Trumpist side, some of part of it anyway. And then I looked around and I said, and this actually is not only here. And that took me back to my studies that you mentioned in Nazi Germany. The long-standing question, how did so many Christians give themselves up to Hitler? It takes us into the same zip code of concerns. An authoritarian leader promising a counter-revolution against secularization, kind of nodding in the direction of Christianity, and a bunch of Christians saying, yes, yes, sir, you're who we want. So I started, okay, let's look at Germany again. I saw some similar patterns, and then I thought, oh, well, you know, this also happened in post-revolutionary France. And so I turned to France, you know, in the 18th and 19th century. And then I said, and this helps to explain some of the attraction of somebody like Putin, especially before the invasion of Ukraine, and Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Bolsonaro in Brazil. So I decided I needed to write chapter studies of each of these. And then Poland got in there too. And then all of a sudden, there's also a chapter that looks pretty seriously at modern Israel as an example of a counter-revolutionary religious politics against the founding vision of the state. And all of a sudden, I think the comparisons held. Authoritarian, reactionary religious politics is the story. And did you think I made my case, Robbie? You can tell the whole world whether you think I made my case.
You know, it's what was great about it. So yes, and I think what was great about it, David, is that I had little pieces of this. You know, I'm mostly an Americanist, so I had like little pieces of this, like questions like, so why did Tucker Carlson take his show to Hungary? What is going on there, right? What's that about? Why is Fox News being shot from Hungary? And your book really helped me understand, why is Franklin Graham going to Moscow, right? Why are there these evangelical conferences, being held, you know, in Russia? And particularly, I remember Franklin Graham saying all of these things in praise of Putin and denigrating Obama, right? And praising the melding, the way that Putin had leveraged the Orthodox Church in Russia to kind of create this marriage between the state and the church, and then to suppress like everybody else, right? That didn't fit that vision. So I think what was helpful for me was to sort of say, okay, there's a playbook here, right? That's being shared in real. These aren't coincidences, and these people are actually cross-fertilizing, you know, each other and know each other, and so there's kind of activists and you know, actors that are actively seeding, you know, these things. And again, when you get a network like Fox News transplanting its top news program into an authoritarian state, you know, that's not a subtle move. But I have to say, what helped was to kind of crystallize all of that into like this kind of, oh, I see, there is this movement, and it's essentially, as you said, a kind of authoritarian movement, but it has in it this, you know, suppression of pluralism, and a kind of authoritarianism over democracy, in many cases, a Christian state over pluralism, and it's oppressive and violent, and it enforces that with violence at the end of the day.
And there's often a racial dimension in
Yeah.
Europe. I mean, the primal racial dimension was anti-Semitism, and you see that in Hungary. Have seen it in Russia. Anti-Sinti and Roma is part of it in Europe, especially. But the idea that the nation does not consist, the real nation does not consist of all of its people. It consists of the previous religio-ethnic majority that is really angry that anybody would think that the country belongs to all of the people that are there. It belongs to us. It's our country. And so I think this helps to explain a lot of the supposed anti-woke, anti-CRT, anti-whatever. It's all of it is coding for, this is our country. We get to tell the story. We get to control the levers of power. We notice that we're slipping in power. And so you and I are both, you might say, coming at the narrative basis of the politics that remain such a powerful force in our country. And Christianity is all tangled up in it. So I wanted to ask you, like, in your book, what is the main way you say that Christianity would you say that Christianity got compromised by the narrative and habit of white supremacy?
Yeah, I don't know, it'd be interesting to know whether there's whether we see this slightly differently. The more I study this, David, the more I am resistant to using language like Christianity was co-opted or Christianity was compromised. I am more and more convinced that, at least as far back as we can trace the version of Christianity that we have inherited, it is inside the building. It is inside the theology. It's not something that comes from without and infects it. It is there from the beginning. And that's really has been a difficult thing for me to kind of wrap my head around, as someone who, loved the church, grew up in the church, have seminary degree, very much inside of this world, and in many cases am who I am because of that world. And then realizing at the same time, the one thing that's really stayed with me is Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, where he describes white Christians as sitting safely behind the anesthetizing power of stained glass windows, right? And this idea that we could and did sit inside these churches comfortably with all kinds of white supremacist ideas swirling around and present and animating who we are and what we did. There's no way to look at the history of pretty much any major Southern church and not see, and again, not just in the South. One thing I do in the book is I talk about Duluth, Minnesota, right? Can't get much further north than that. And, in this good Lutheran, good Catholic town with very few African Americans, 10,000 people turned out for a lynching in 1920. It was a tenth of the population of the town at the time. And there were only a couple of clergy that stood up and tried to shout down the crowd. And they were just summarily dismissed, had no moral authority whatsoever with the crowd. And, you have to think that one of the reasons for that is that they had, for so long, coddled and allowed a version of Christianity that was absolutely comfortable with white supremacy to exist, so that when they needed the moral authority to stand up and stop the violence, they literally didn't have a leg to stand on. So I think for me that the challenging thing is, if we're going to, it's sort of like, I think about it. You and I, know each other well. I had this bout with cancer back in 2011, and I thought about that a lot as a metaphor for the Christian church and where it is. When you get a diagnosis that's pretty dire, and then you're presented with treatment that's also pretty dire in many cases, chemotherapy, surgery, but you sign up and you endure it because you're aiming for help at the end. And I think that we have allowed this to sit in our liturgies and what we've preached and not preached, in our hymns for so long that it's going to take something pretty dramatic. Like, this is not a minor course correction or correcting around the edges. This is a parasite we've allowed to symbiotically live in our theology and churches in a way that to expel it is going to be quite dramatic. It's going to require some really uncomfortable transitions. And so I think for me, that's more and more the conclusion that, it's going to be almost something akin to a bone marrow transplant, where you have to like literally kill the antibodies that are in order to kind of, retrain the system to get back toward health.
There's a lot of literature about the history of white supremacy and Christianity, and I'm noticing people go back to different starting points. You decided to start with basically the doctrine of discovery, the papal division of the world between Portugal and Spain. Hey, divide it up and take it. And I'm glad you took us there in your book, and also the Requerimento document, the extraordinary document. We read this statement to you in Latin, and you either knuckle under or we kill you. I ran into that document when I was studying Bartolomé de las Casas, related to the Spaniards in Latin America. Same thing. So some people say that's where we should trace the story. Some people say it's the anti-Semitism that goes deep into the early part of Christian history is where we should start the story. Some people would say it's Constantine and Christendom. If you take it back that far, you're talking the vast majority of the history of the church. Would you settle on the doctrine of discovery and the colonial conquering Christian mindset as the best place to start this story?
Yeah, I mean, the book, I argue that at least for the United States context, I wanted to sort of move it back further so that we could account for the kind of Christianity that landed on the shores here. And so I needed to at least go back for the Republic to first European contact. And that's kind of where I landed on the doctrine of discovery, which I don't think we've said, but it's basically a 15th century set of Vatican documents and edicts from the Pope that, as you said, it's about dividing the world between the European Christian powers. And it's notable that the metric it uses for who deserves human rights essentially is whether they're Christian or not. And if the land is occupied by non-Christian peoples, which all of these lands that were quote unquote newly discovered were, then they literally have no rights, and they're considered to be quote enemies of Christ. This kind of bellicose language there, and then spelled out in these documents are literally that you have permission to occupy, steal their possessions, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Right? This is from the hand of the head of the Christian Church in the 15th century, and it's what sets the entire colonial project. It predates and sets off the transatlantic slave trade. Right? It's all right there. Now, I think you're exactly right that we could go back to the treatment to the violence toward Muslims and Jews during the Crusades, and you could certainly trace it back to Constantine, right? And we're talking now like 4th century, all the way back, and that leaves very little Christian history, as you said, free of this marriage. But I think at the end of the day, it is a kind of marriage of the state, the political power, and the faith, and the leaders of the church deciding that it's in their interests to advance this marriage, both for their own power, their own wealth, and to advance the superiority of. And it's always ethno-religious, right? It's not just religious; it's ethno-religious, to advance this superior sense of European peoples over other peoples, and Christianity over other religions, and that's just so deep and so wide in our history.
And then European gets defined racially as white, and then
right.
off you go with that being racialized. So I would say that one of the things I do in my book is to say that the historic African American Christian tradition in the U.S. is a tradition of descent from all of this. And so we need resources for resistance. And as we look at the 2024 presidential election, and it looks like these issues are going to be, and this problem is going to be front and center. How would you encourage your readers to kind of connect your book to what we're looking at right this minute?
Yeah, I think that exactly right. I mean, I think you and I have both been very deeply shaped and challenged by the witness of African American Christians. And then this book also, I not only, had Frederick Douglass ringing in my ears of him talking about the slave bell and the church, the slave auctioneer's bell and the church bell ring at the same time, right? You have human beings sold to raise money to send Bibles across the ocean, like those kinds of contradictions that he was, articulating. And then, came across other things like the Native American scholar named Vine Deloria Jr., who I really wasn't that familiar with prior to kind of conducting the research of the book. But, in the early 70s, he writes this just heartbreaking thing called An Open Letter to the Christian Churches in North America, where he talks about and basically just pleads with white Christians to be honest with themselves about their own history and their treatment of indigenous people, and then to act in a better way toward them, and to kind of honor their promises and their treaties and toward Native Americans. And it largely just went unheeded, in the 1970s. But I think for me, it's like those things have definitely shaped it. And I'll make it really personal. Here it is so shaped what I'm doing that so my son just turned 13 this year. My wife's Jewish, and so we're talking about kind of this formative year when you're 13, right? 12 to 13, do a bar mitzvah in the Jewish tradition, kind of coming of age thing. And so we were both thinking about, like, how can we do this? How can we introduce or kind of help him understand some things that are important for both of us religiously. And I realized that the thing that I instinctively reached for to help him understand a kind of Christianity that I wanted to pass down to him was Howard Thurman, right? Jesus and the Disinherited.
Yep.
And it's that route, because, and honestly, David, what I thought was, if that's the thing we're talking about, if that's the vision of Jesus that we pass on to the next generation, that's a pretty good inoculation against the Jesus of white Christian nationalism, because they're basically unrecognizable.
Yeah, we need resistance Christianity, but it can't be a withdrawn resistance Christianity. It has to be an engaged resistance Christianity. Well, Robbie, thank you for this conversation. Congratulations on your book. I look forward to being in conversation with you in a variety of settings about it. But there's so much at stake. We're not messing around here. This is not academic game playing. This is real life, soul of the country, soul of the church kind of conversation. And I know we're both shoulder to shoulder on that. So thank you, Robbie.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and congrats to you on your amazing book. And yeah, its breadth, I'm still kind of in awe of its international scope and breadth. So thank you for kind of helping us, giving us that lens to see. And I think you're right, to see the real challenge and dilemma that we're facing in this country. That if we really can't, don't want to affirm that the country is, a kind of, as the Doctrine of Discovery said, a kind of promised land for European Christians. If that's not who we are, we're going to have to stand up and say so, right? Because we've been so unwilling. I think people who look like us and come out of the white Christian church have been so unwilling to call that out. But I think we're going to have to call that out if democracy is going to survive, and and have us something intact to hand down to our kids.